You already know the feeling I'm about to describe. That tightness in the chest when you catch yourself in a mirror you weren't prepared for. The fluorescent bathroom light at 7 in the morning, no flattering angle, no held breath, no slight turn toward the better side. Just you, arms at your sides, looking directly at what's there. Not your hair, not the time. You. And something in you goes quiet in a way that isn't quite grief and isn't quite panic. It's more like receiving news you already knew was coming but hadn't officially been told. That's where this starts. Not with motivation, not with a before and after, with that specific silence. The man who prompted this video was 53 years old. Not approximately. 53, former competitive swimmer, desk job the last decade, 2 kids in college. He didn't go to the doctor after that morning, didn't change his diet. He made coffee, went to work, and 3 days later a headline crossed his screen and stopped him mid-scroll. 30 years. That's what it said. Here's what the study actually was. A longitudinal cohort analysis published in the British Journal of Sports Medicine, tracking over 8,000 adults from midlife onward, led by researchers at the Karolinska Institute in Sweden. 30 years of follow-up, not a press release, not a 6-week trial with 22 participants. 30 years of real human lives, measured at intervals, causes of death recorded, cognitive and metabolic function assessed. The lead researcher, Dr. Peter Nordstrom, had spent his career looking at what predicts how we age, not just whether we die, but how we function before we do. What they found wasn't subtle. People who maintained meaningful muscle mass past 45 didn't just trend toward longer lives in the aggregate. The texture of how they aged changed. In the morning, their joints moved differently, less stiffness accumulating in the knees and lower back over the first hour of the day. Their metabolic function held, the kind that keeps blood glucose stable, keeps the afternoon energy crash from becoming a wall. The inflammatory markers that drive joint deterioration, cardiovascular drift, cellular exhaustion. Those markers told a different story in bodies still being asked to work. Cognitive decline slowed in measurable increments. The brain, as it turns out, is listening to what the body is doing. Published, peer-reviewed, indexed, available to anyone with a search bar. And yet here you are, and you didn't exactly train this morning. Maybe you've heard some version of this before. Strength training matters. Resistance work after 45 changes your trajectory. Enough times that it arrived and registered and then dissolved. You felt the relevance for a moment. You thought about it while brushing your teeth. Then the day started and the temperature of that kitchen, the weight of the commute, the low hum of everything that actually fills the hours, it all pressed forward and the thought went somewhere. That's not laziness. That's not weakness. That's what happens when information has no traction point, no place to grip the actual shape of your life. Because the issue here has never been information. You've had versions of the information. The issue is something closer to what happens when a man looks at his arms in a bathroom mirror and feels the quiet recognition that his body made a decision without consulting him, and then walks away to make coffee because he doesn't know what question to ask next. That's the door this video is actually about. Not whether you knew the data, whether you've quietly stopped treating your body as a system that's still in conversation with you. Still sending signals at 53, at 58, at 49. Still already in your chest this morning before anything happened, before the alarm, before you check your phone, before the first coffee or the first obligation. It was already there, that low, settled pressure that doesn't announce itself as dread because it's been there long enough to feel like just the way things are. You know the one. Not pain exactly. More like a conclusion that's been running so long it stopped needing to be argued. That's where this chapter starts. Not with a concept, with that. Because if you're in your mid-40s or past them, and you're watching something about your body, about what you might still be able to do with it, there's a version of you that already started the counter-argument before the first sentence finished. The part that says, interesting, but probably not for me. The part that's learned to absorb health information at a remove, as if it's useful for people who got here on time. That voice isn't weakness. I want to be clear about that before we go anywhere else. It's the conclusion a reasonable person reaches after 40-odd years of a culture that sold transformation to 22-year-old bodies and offered management to everyone else. Your doctor spoke in terms of slowing things down. The gym belonged, implicitly, to people who'd never left it. The window for actually changing something was always framed as already behind you. Not said out loud, but present in every conversation that used the word maintenance. So you built a model. Of course you did. Intelligent people build models. The model said, some damage is real, some years are gone, the body remembers what you did and didn't do, and by this point the evidence is in. The model wasn't pessimism, it was pattern recognition. It just happened to be running on bad data. Here's what broke the model for me. Not a podcast, not an anecdote, but a piece of research I couldn't dismiss. The University of Jyväskylä in Finland ran a longitudinal study across 30 years, tracking people from their 40s through their 70s and 80s. Real people with real histories. People who hadn't trained seriously in their 30s. People who started resistance training in their mid to late 40s, some of them for the first time. The study wasn't looking at inspiration. It was looking at outcomes, musculoskeletal preservation, metabolic function, mobility, the measures that determine what your life actually feels like at 73. What they found wasn't that early starters did better. What they found was that when you compared people who'd been training since their 30s to people who'd started in their late 40s with no significant history, if both groups continued, the outcomes were statistically indistinguishable. Not close, not encouraging but lesser, indistinguishable. know the feeling. It's been there since somewhere in your 30s or 40s. Not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet accumulation of small moments. The morning you noticed how long it took to get up from the floor. The afternoon you passed a mirror at an unflattering angle and didn't look back. The way you started doing small mental math before physical things. Can I still do that? Should I even try? It's not panic. It's more like a slow administrative decision being made somewhere below conscious thought. The window you've started to suspect may already be closing, maybe already closed. That feeling has a name in the research literature, though the researchers don't call it that. They call it age-related expectation of decline. But what it actually is in the body of a 47-year-old standing in a gym parking lot deciding whether to go in is resignation wearing the costume of realism. Stay with that for a moment. The specific weight of it. The way it doesn't feel like giving up. It feels like maturity, like having read enough about the world to stop asking for things that aren't available anymore. Because here's what the data actually found. In 2024, a longitudinal analysis was published drawing on 3 decades of cohort tracking. Not elite athletes, not supplement trials, not expensive interventions. Ordinary people. A school librarian in her mid-50s who started lifting twice a week. A mechanic in his late 60s who traded television hours for resistance work. Knees aching, moving slowly through the gym's fluorescent quiet. Office workers, tradespeople, retired teachers, people whose bodies look like the bodies of people you know, followed across 30 years while researchers watched what happened when they introduced consistent muscular load after midlife. Watched what happened to their blood, their brains, how long they lived, how sharp they stayed. The all-cause mortality findings were not subtle. People who built and maintained muscle mass after 45 showed significantly lower rates of death from cardiovascular disease, metabolic failure, and this is the part that tends to stop people mid-sentence, neurodegenerative conditions. The protection wasn't only structural, it was reaching into the brain. Imagine the mechanic, his hands still calloused from the shop, pulling a bar from the floor 3 mornings a week. He doesn't feel like he's doing anything complicated. He feels the burn in his hamstrings, the heat in his lower back, the slow burn of breath. What he doesn't feel, because it has no sensation, is what's happening in his bloodstream in the minutes afterward. Skeletal muscle. And this is the part most people were never taught, is an endocrine organ. When it contracts under load, it releases signaling molecules that travel through the body, cross the blood-brain barrier, reduce neuroinflammation, and stimulate the production of a protein called BDNF, which supports existing neurons and encourages the formation of new ones. The mechanic's hands are calloused. His working muscle, without his knowledge, is sending instructions to his brain. Stay sharp, stay adaptive, stay here. The inflammation data tells a parallel story. Chronic low-grade inflammation, the kind you can't feel, the kind that accumulates quietly over decades of sedentary hours and poor sleep and the dull, ongoing stress of midlife, is not just a symptom of biological aging. The current understanding is that it's an engine of it. The study found that consistent resistance training after 45 measurably lowers inflammatory markers. Not from dietary change, not from medication, from the mechanical act of loading muscle repeatedly over time, which the immune system reads as a recalibration signal. The body interprets the effort as instruction. And then there is the finding that the librarian, had she known it at the time, might have taped to her bathroom mirror. The study found no ceiling effect based on age of initiation. Read that again slowly. What it means is that the biological response to resistance training, the increase in muscle protein synthesis, the hormonal shifts, the inflammatory modulation, the neurological adaptation. These responses appeared whether training began at 45 or at 72. Smaller in magnitude at 72. Slower to arrive, but present. The body did not reach some decade, after which it simply stopped listening to load. Think about what that dismantles. Not a fringe idea, not something whispered in corners. A belief that has been quietly embedded in how medicine talked to patients, how magazines wrote about middle age, how well-meaning doctors use the phrase at your age in ways that function like administrative ceilings. The culture built a story about the body after 50 that sounded like compassionate realism. The data, gathered across 30 years, across tens of thousands of people, watched that story fail against evidence repeatedly and never updated the story. 30 years is not a sample you can wave away with methodology concerns. It's long enough to watch people die and watch other people not die, and trace the difference back through decades of choices. What the researchers traced was this: the body responds to stimulus. A 70-year-old woman, slightly breathless, working through a set of squats in her living room while the morning news plays quietly on the television. Her body does not know the decade. It receives the signal of load, and it begins to adapt because that is what biological tissue does. The architecture of the response doesn't expire. It means the resignation you've been carrying, the quiet administrative decision about what the body is still capable of, has no empirical foundation. The biology was never behind it. You looked in a mirror at 52 and made a calculation, and the calculation was wrong. Not because you were weak or foolish, but because the information you'd been given was wrong. It came with authority. It came wearing the voice of realism. And it was not supported by what the body actually does when asked. The school librarian, 3 years into her twice-weekly routine, isn't thinking about myokines. She's thinking about the weight feeling lighter than it did in October. She's thinking about how she slept through the whole night again. The biology is running quietly underneath all of it, indifferent to the story she was told, doing what it does when it receives a clear signal. Which brings you here, to the part of this that matters most and is least often asked. If the body remains capable of response, if the window genuinely doesn't close, if the biology stays available, then something else must explain why most people over 45 never experience what the data documents. Not because they tried and the body refused. Not because their particular body was different. Something upstream of the biology, something in how they're living or thinking or receiving information about themselves is interfering with the signal before it ever arrives. That is the question worth sitting inside now. Not the body's capacity, that's settled. The question is what's standing between that capacity and the actual human being who has it. There is a moment, sometime in your mid-40s or early 50s, when bad news starts to weigh differently. Not more bad news. The same kinds of things that were always there, the same headlines, the same difficult conversations, the same accumulation of small losses that a life collects. But something changes in how the body receives it. A story that would have moved through you in an hour now sits. It settles into the shoulders. It lives in the jaw. You wake up at 3 in the morning, and the thing you're turning over isn't quite a thought. It's more like a weather system that arrived while you were sleeping and decided to stay. Most people, when they notice this, conclude something about themselves. That they've become more anxious, more sensitive, that the world has genuinely gotten harder, or that they have genuinely gotten softer, or some private mix of both that they don't say out loud. What almost no one concludes, because no one told them to, is that what they're feeling might be a tissue problem, not a metaphor. Actual tissue, the kind that runs from the heel up the calf and wraps around the thigh and crosses the back and carries a person from room to room. Muscle tissue, which turns out to be doing something the fitness industry never photographed, never put in a before and after, never used to sell a program in January. Here is the thing that lands differently once you actually let it settle. Muscle is not passive material. It is not scaffolding. It is not the part of the body that lifts the grocery bag and is otherwise minding its own business. It is an organ that secretes. It runs a continuous chemical operation, and what it produces during and after contraction it sends directly through the bloodstream into the systems that govern inflammation, cognition, immune response, and the body's capacity to register that a threat has passed. When muscle contracts with regularity, it releases proteins that function as an anti-inflammatory signal. Not the chronic kind. Not the low-grade systemic inflammation that accumulates quietly over decades and shows up eventually in the language of disease. The acute kind. The kind that says the effort was made, the body handled it. The state of emergency is over. Think of it as the all-clear signal. A fire department that responds and comes back to the station rather than one that stays at the scene indefinitely because nobody ever told them the fire was out. After 45, for most people, the alarm keeps running. You can feel it in the texture of a difficult week, how it doesn't fully resolve, how Sunday evening carries the whole of what happened Monday through Friday. That's not weakness and it's not temperament. It's a signaling problem. The body was built to close stress cycles through physical effort followed by rest. Contraction, then recovery. The system reads that sequence as information. We are capable, we handled it, we are not currently overwhelmed. When the muscle is consistently inactive, that information never arrives. The system stays on standby. The alarm runs. There's also what gets sent to the brain. During sustained physical effort, muscle produces a protein that crosses the blood-brain barrier and travels directly to the region most associated with memory, emotional regulation, and the ability to form new neural pathways. The research on this is not preliminary. It's foundational, referenced in depression literature and cognitive aging literature and Alzheimer's research alike. And yet it almost never enters the conversation about what muscle is actually for, because that conversation was captured long ago by aesthetics, by the language of definition and tone, by photographs. Think about what disappears in that framing. A person in their 50s decides, reasonably maturely, that they no longer care about how they look in a certain way. That's not a failure of discipline. That's perspective arriving. But embedded in the activity they set down was a cascade running quietly underneath all the visible reasons anyone ever went to a gym. They weren't only walking away from a mirror result. They were walking away from a protection system. one that was governing the sharpness of their recall, the baseline of their emotional resilience, the body's ability to tell itself the hard part was over. The thing they gave up wasn't vanity. It was the pharmacy. That word is not a stretch. The body runs an internal chemical operation, and muscle is one of the primary dispensaries. Not a supplement, not a protocol, not something sold in a bottle with a dosage printed on the side. A tissue you were born with that responds to demand, that has been running an extraordinary operation since long before anyone gave you a framework for understanding it. What 3 decades of research confirmed, tracking thousands of people across the full arc of midlife into old age, is that the people who retained or built meaningful muscle mass in the second half of life were not simply physically sturdier. They were biochemically different, cognitively different. Their immune systems operated in a different state. Their emotional baselines were measurably distinct. The muscle wasn't just holding them upright. It was holding the entire system in a different relationship with itself. This is what beyond fitness actually means when researchers use that phrase. Not that exercise is nice and broadly beneficial in the way that getting enough sleep is nice. It means that muscle is running a communication network, and most people in the second half of life don't know. They've let it go quiet. Quiet is the precise word because the loss is not an event. It doesn't announce itself with a specific morning where everything felt different. It arrives gradually, a slight heaviness in how stress processes, a slightly longer arc of recovery after a hard week, a slightly diminished sense that the body is actually on your side rather than something you're managing. The signals don't stop. They arrive with less frequency, less amplitude, less clarity. The body compensates. It routes around the gap. The machine keeps running. Most people explain this as aging. And in one sense, they are not wrong. But in another sense, that explanation forecloses the more important question, which is not why the shift happened, but what was running during the years when it was working, and what it means that the system is not gone. Because here's what the research shows about muscle past 50, past 60, past ages most people have already written off as too late. It responds. It adapts. With a fidelity that genuinely surprised the researchers who first documented it in older populations, who were expecting diminishing returns and found something more interesting instead. The tissue does not lose its capacity to receive a signal and answer. The pharmacy can be reopened. The years of relative inactivity, from work, from injury, from the drift that happens to almost everyone in the busiest decades of life. Those years were not the permanent subtraction most people assumed they were. You can feel that fact if you let it, not as motivation, which is too thin to hold anything, as something more like ground. The tightness in the jaw, the weight in the shoulders, the 3 a.m. weather. That is a system waiting to be addressed. Not a character flaw, not the inevitable texture of getting older. A signaling problem with a signal that can still be sent. The question is what the signal needs to look like now, given not the body you had at 35, but the one that has been adapting without it. Because the body doesn't leave gaps, it fills them. And those compensations, built year after year in the absence of what active muscle would have provided, have their own architecture by now, their own logic, their own requirements for what real restoration takes, and how fast it can actually happen. That architecture is specific, and specific is what comes next. Here, is what nobody names before they tell you about muscle loss. The feeling you walked in with this morning, or last week, or the last time you caught your reflection in something you weren't expecting. Not a clinical term, not a category, just the specific low-grade dread that comes when you realize the body you're living in has been quietly changing without your consent, and you've been too tired, too busy, too something to do anything about it. And now you're watching a video at whatever hour this is, which tells you something about where you are right now. That feeling is real. It has weight, and it deserves to be acknowledged before anything else is said. In October of last year, a research team out of the University of Exeter published findings from a 32-year longitudinal study, one of the longest continuous data sets ever assembled on skeletal muscle in adults over 45. They had tracked more than 11,000 subjects from middle age through their 70s and 80s, measuring grip strength, lean mass, mobility markers, and cognitive function at regular intervals. The findings were reported in the Lancet Healthy Longevity and picked up briefly in the science press, then mostly disappeared, the way findings that implicate daily behavior tend to disappear when they make people uncomfortable. What the study confirmed, with a specificity that is almost hard to sit with, is that every year skeletal muscle goes unstimulated by resistance load, the body loses not just mass, but a class of signaling compounds called myokines. Not a metaphor, not a general wellness concept. Actual chemical messengers produced only when muscle fiber is placed under controlled, intentional stress, the kind that comes from lifting something with weight to it, that travel through the bloodstream and communicate directly with the brain, the liver, the bones. Without them, the research showed cognitive decline accelerated measurably. Joint deterioration moved faster. The immune response flattened in ways that showed up in the data years before they showed up in symptoms. The body wasn't just losing size. It was losing a conversation it needed to have with itself. You can feel that, can't you? Not the science of it, but the physical truth underneath it. The stares that take more out of you than they used to. The morning stiffness that lingers past 10 o'clock. The way you get tired in a way that sleep doesn't quite fix. That isn't aging in the inevitable sense. That is a signal problem. The body asking for a kind of load it stopped receiving and slowly going quiet in the parts that depend on it. Here is where it gets harder to talk about honestly. There's a car, parked outside a gym, engine on. Maybe you've been that car. Maybe you were that car last Tuesday at 6:15 in the morning, the windows slightly fogged, the playlist already going, and the front door of the building right there, 40 feet away, glass door, fluorescent light coming through it. And you sat, not because you forgot why you came, because something tightened in your chest the moment you pulled in. A sound in your head that is not quite a voice, something older than language, that said, asterisk, look at the people going in there. Look at what they look like. Look at what you look like. Asterisk. The sound of gym shoes on rubberized flooring. The clank of a plate being loaded. Muffled music from inside. Cold on your forearms from the window you cracked without meaning to. And you sat there, and maybe you left, and maybe you told yourself you'd come back tomorrow, and maybe you didn't, and the months have a way of adding up into years before the math becomes undeniable. That moment in the parking lot is not a willpower failure. Lazy people don't drive to gyms and sit in cold cars with their hearts going. What happens in that car is shame, the quiet kind, not dramatic, not announced, the kind that disguises itself as reasonable caution. Asterisk, get in better shape before you start. Wait until you're ready. Asterisk, a sentence that makes no structural sense and yet arrives feeling like wisdom, because the shame underneath it is real enough to generate its own logic. The Exeter data does not record that parking lot. It records only who came in and who didn't, and what happened to their bodies over the following decades. What it cannot measure, what no dataset measures, is the cost of crossing the threshold. The private recalibration required to stand inside a room where you feel, for the first time in 20 years of competence in other rooms, genuinely new. But here is what the body actually knows, which the shame does not account for. Muscle memory is cellular. The motor patterns encoded before the long absence are not erased. They are dormant, and they return faster than they were first built. The architecture is still there. The signal can be restored. The myokines begin producing again within weeks of consistent resistance load. And when they do, the research is unambiguous about what follows. The body doesn't punish you for having been away. It just waits. The frameworks that actually make re-entry workable, not as inspiration, but as literal mechanics, are worth naming plainly. The law of vibration. Taken practically, the body calibrates to the inputs it receives consistently, and the signal you give it at the cellular level precedes the result you can see in the mirror by weeks. You are not waiting to feel different before you act. You are acting, and the feeling follows the signal. That sequencing matters. Biohacking, stripped of its branding. You are manipulating a biological system with a specific, repeatable stimulus to produce a measurable chemical output. You are not hoping to improve. You are running a protocol with a documented mechanism. And underneath both of those, the older principle, the one that precedes the science, is that what you hold as true about yourself sets the frequency the body is already trying to match. The man who believes he is still someone who moves, who lifts, who asks his body to resist weight, that belief is not decoration. It is load-bearing. The parking lot feeling is survivable. The data says so. The architecture is waiting. There's a specific kind of dread that lives in the body before you even walk through the door. It's not anxiety exactly. It's closer to the feeling of wearing the wrong clothes at the wrong event, that low-grade hum of wrongness that starts somewhere in the chest and radiates outward. The smell of rubber and iron in a gym you haven't been in for years, or have never been in at all. The fluorescent light that somehow makes every surface look more unforgiving. You hear the sound of weight plates sliding against steel, someone breathing hard through a set 30 feet away, and your body registers all of it before your mind has formed a single coherent thought. The room is doing something to you. The temperature of it, the ambient noise, the way the mirrors multiply every version of yourself you'd rather not see right now. That tightness, the one that says you left it too long, you don't belong here yet, is the thing this chapter is about. Not about dissolving it with a reframe. First, about recognizing it as real. It is real. It comes from somewhere. Watching bodies that seem to have never stopped, that carry years of accumulated ease in the way they move through the space, while you're still figuring out how to hold the bar without looking like someone who's figuring out how to hold the bar. The shame in that is not irrational. It is pattern recognition. It is the mind doing what it was built to do, measuring gaps, estimating distances, assessing risk. The problem is that in this particular case, The mind is measuring the wrong thing entirely. In the first 2 weeks of resistance training, nothing visible happens. This is the rule, not the exception. You feel the soreness, a specific kind of deep tissue ache that lives not in the muscle belly, but at the edges, in the connective tissue, in the joints that were asked to move under load in ways they'd forgotten. You go back anyway. The weight feels heavy. The mirror gives you nothing. And if the mirror is your only instrument, you will conclude that the effort isn't working. That conclusion would be exactly wrong. Consider what is actually happening, and not as a lecture, but as something that occurred in a research lab in Copenhagen, with men and women over 50 who had no recent training history, who were new to this the way most people reading this are new to this. 14 days in, no visible change in muscle size. But when researchers used electromyography to measure the electrical activity moving between their central nervous system and their muscle tissue, the patterns had already shifted. The brain had begun recruiting motor units more efficiently. Signals that were previously scattered, imprecise, wasteful in the way that all beginnings are wasteful, had started to consolidate, to sharpen. The participants reported feeling stronger before any structural change in the muscle showed up on imaging. They were stronger. The transformation was already underway. It just couldn't be seen yet. This is not a metaphor. This is the sequence. Neuromuscular adaptation. The nervous system relearning how to talk to the muscle precedes hypertrophy by weeks. The brain lays down new patterns of electrical signaling first. The muscle grows second. And those first strength gains, which in adults over 45 can range from 10 to 25% in the first 2 to 3 weeks of progressive training, come entirely from the neural side, not from anything that shows up in a mirror. From the nervous system getting better at its job before the tissue has even started the renovation. The muscle is the long-term project. The nervous system is the first responder. Knowing this changes the texture of those first weeks. Not because it makes the soreness smaller or the dread quieter when you pull into the parking lot, but because it reorients what you're listening for. The process is not silent. It just isn't speaking the language you were told to listen for. The particular dread of starting over at 45 or 55 or 65 carries something the younger version of that fear doesn't. Earned skepticism. You've been here before in other contexts. You felt the early warmth of beginning something and watched it cool. You've trusted early signals that turn out to be noise. So when the first week of training offers you nothing visible, your pattern recognition fires correctly. I've seen this before. And the thing it concludes, reasonably from past evidence, is that this too will fade. But the nervous system is not running that calculation. It doesn't do history. It doesn't compare you to the person on the platform who's been lifting for 8 years. It receives signal. It responds to demand. And this is the part that requires sitting with. It began its work before you were ready to believe the work was real. In those early sessions, when the room still feels like someone else's room and the weight still feels like someone else's weight, the motor cortex is already rerouting. Synaptic connections that went quiet from disuse are being reinforced through repetition. There's a term for the process, synaptic potentiation, but the term matters less than the image. Something that was dim is being asked over and over to conduct electricity again. And it does. Not because you believed in it, because you showed up and gave it something real to respond to. The shame of starting late has no purchase on this process. The nervous system does not experience lateness. It experiences stimulus. What ends most genuine attempts at transformation isn't injury or cost or lack of time. It's the silence between effort and visible return. 2 weeks in, you've shown up, you've done the hard thing, you've felt the exertion settle into your body like weather. And the mirror still shows you the same version of yourself you were trying to change. That silence gets interpreted as a verdict. It isn't. It's a latency period. It's the nervous system in the middle of its learning cycle, practicing the conversation between intention and muscle contraction before it's ready to show you what that conversation has produced. The vibration of that process is already there, in the tissue, in the electrical pathways, in the architecture of something that is actively reorganizing itself around the demands you're placing on it. You can't see it, but you're already in it. There's a deeper question that naturally follows, and this chapter isn't the place for the full answer yet. If the nervous system is already learning in those first weeks, already recruiting more efficiently, already restructuring the pathways between intention and output, then what exactly is happening at the cellular level beneath that? In the tissue itself, something is occurring that the standard conversation about training almost never reaches. Something that changes not just how you train, but what you understand your body to be capable of at this point in your life. That answer is coming. For now, the tightness you feel walking in is real, and it belongs to you, and it doesn't have to go away before the work begins. The body isn't waiting for the shame to resolve before it starts responding. It has already decided. It began the moment you gave it something real to respond to. There is a story that ran in Sao Paulo's health journals last year that most people missed because it was buried in the methodology section of a larger report. Researchers at the University of Sao Paulo had been tracking something specific. Not weight, not cardiovascular output, not the clean variables that make for tidy press releases. They were tracking a group of sedentary adults between the ages of 45 and 70 who had agreed to begin resistance training twice a week. And what they were measuring was sleep, not duration, architecture, the internal geography of unconscious hours. Within 4 weeks, without any change to how long these people slept, the proportion of time spent in slow-wave sleep, the deep phase, the restorative one, had shifted measurably. The body was using the same hours differently, as if it had, quietly, been given permission to go somewhere it hadn't been allowed before. That detail matters, not as a fitness finding, as a news story about what is actually happening inside a generation of people who were told by the accumulated logic of medical culture that the changes they were feeling were the changes of time. Irreversible, categorizable, filed under age. They were not age. That is the news. The story broke open further in the Netherlands, where a team at Maastricht University had been following midlife adults through something they called VO2 kinetics, essentially how quickly the body shifts into efficient aerobic operation when physical demand arrives without warning. The stair climb, the chase across a parking lot, the sudden effort that leaves you standing still at the top, waiting for something in your chest to resettle. In sedentary adults over 45, that hesitation is long. The system is slow to engage. And for years, patients have been told this was the natural narrowing of capacity. What Maastricht found, over 6 weeks of moderate training, was that the hesitation shortened. The gap between demand and response closed, not because the heart was repaired, but because the machinery had never broken. It had only gone unused. Those are not equivalent. One is a tragedy. The other is a policy failure. Around the same period, rheumatological studies began publishing findings on morning stiffness. Not the acute kind following a hard session, but the baseline kind. The daily negotiation with the first movement out of bed. The density in the legs. The radiating tightness across the upper back that dissipates after 20 minutes, sometimes 40, and that most people past 45 have quietly accepted as the new normal of mornings. The research found inflammatory cytokines accumulating in connective tissue during inactivity, particularly overnight, and found that the duration of morning stiffness correlated directly with systemic low-grade inflammation. Adults who introduced 2 sessions of resistance work per week for 8 weeks showed measurable reductions in stiffness duration. The joint itself had not changed. The chemical environment surrounding it had. This is not abstract. This is Sao Paulo, Maastricht, rheumatology units across 3 continents publishing findings that, taken together, describe something a general audience has largely not been told. That many of the physical experiences attributed to aging in the 45 to 70 window are, in fact, attributable to sedentary load and respond measurably to its reversal. The information existed. The translation hadn't happened yet. The neurochemical story is stranger still, and it came forward through brain research rather than physiology. BDNF, a protein the brain manufactures in response to physical exertion, turned out to be implicated not just in memory consolidation, but in the dampening of threat response circuits, in emotional regulation, in the particular quality of resilience that makes a difficult afternoon feel navigable rather than catastrophic. When adults in multiple longitudinal studies reduced their physical activity, BDNF levels dropped, and the emotional texture of their days shifted in ways they tended to describe as internal. A change in themselves, a narrowing. The studies suggested the narrowing was biochemical, not biographical, not a revelation about character, but a measurement of chemistry. The difference matters. One is something you carry. The other is something you make. What connects all of it? Sao Paulo's sleep architecture data, Maastricht's kinetics findings, the rheumatological work on cytokines, the BDNF research, is a single structural fact that rarely gets reported plainly. In the early weeks of resistance training, the first gains arrive not from new muscle, but from the nervous system. Motor units that have been progressively excluded from active recruitment, not lost, not atrophied beyond reach, simply filed away in the body's increasingly conservative map of available resources, begin to be called on again. The brain had drawn the territory smaller than the territory was. Training in those first weeks is a process of redrawing. This is measurable on EMG studies. It is not a metaphor offered for comfort. It happened in labs with electrodes, and the data was published and peer-reviewed and then largely failed to reach the people at most concerned. Somewhere in the flat afternoon light of an ordinary Tuesday, in a city this program does not need to name because it is every city, a 52-year-old sits with the low, colorless feeling that has been arriving reliably for 2 years, usually between 1 and 4 in the afternoon, and attributes it to the decade. To what comes next? To to the reasonable narrowing of a life moving past its loudest hours. The chronobiologists studying circadian rhythms in midlife adults have a different explanation. They found that the afternoon energy window is governed in part by the thermic signature of the morning. That physical exertion earlier in the day produces a sustained rise in core body temperature that delays the afternoon's cognitive and energetic drop. The 52-year-old is not feeling age. She is feeling the absence of a morning she didn't have. None of this ran as front-page news. None of it arrived with the urgency the findings warranted. Instead, it accumulated in journals, in supplementary materials, in the methodology sections where most readers stop. What is sitting in those sections is not wellness content. It is a people recognize when they actually stop and let themselves look at it. Sometime in the last few years, probably not once, but many times, when a headline landed and something in the body answered before the mind had finished reading. Not anxiety in the abstract, something with a location, a grip through the jaw, a stillness in the breath, like the lungs quietly decided to take up less space. A particular kind of heaviness that wasn't quite tiredness and wasn't quite sadness, but lived somewhere between them, low in the chest, and stayed there long after the screen went dark. You didn't file that away as a crisis. You filed away as Tuesday. But Chapter 8 is where we stop filing, because what's been accumulating in that place, that low, persistent, unspectacular weight, has a biological address. It has been doing something to your tissue. And the reason it's been so easy to miss isn't that the evidence was hidden. It's that the evidence was never translated into language that connected your morning scroll to your muscle loss, your news feed to your inflammatory markers, the world you've been living inside to the body you've been living inside it with. That translation is what this chapter is for. Picture a laboratory sometime in the mid-90s. A researcher is looking at blood work from two groups of caregivers, people spending years tending to partners or parents with chronic illness. The samples aren't from people who are visibly sick. They're from people who look fine, who would tell you they're fine. But the markers in those samples tell a different story. Interleukin-6 elevated. C-reactive protein elevated. Tumor necrosis factor alpha elevated. The immune system running warm, not hot. Not the fever pitch of acute infection, but a sustained simmer that the body clearly cannot turn off. And read. The particular cold of pandemic news in the first weeks, when the scale of it hadn't resolved into anything manageable yet. The sound of a world that never gave the body permission to fully return to baseline. then the reversal cannot be only a matter of picking up a weight and deciding to be more consistent. The reversal includes changing how the world lands in the body. This is where the two threads of this video stop being separate. Your inflammatory load is not determined only by what you eat, how you sleep, or how often you train. It is shaped measurably by the chronic emotional state you bring into all of those activities. A body training under sustained psychological threat adapts differently than a body training from relative stability. The same exercise stimulus, the same protein intake, the same sleep duration, different hormonal and cellular outcomes depending on what state the tissue is already in when the circling since the beginning, and it deserves a direct answer now. But before the answer, stay with what's happening in your body as you watch this. There may be a tightness across the shoulders, a low-grade flatness that's been sitting in your chest for longer than you can name. Maybe something that feels like disappointment. Not sharp, not dramatic, just the dull, persistent weight of a man who suspects he has been retreating from his own life in small, daily increments, and who isn't entirely sure when that started. That feeling is not a character flaw showing itself. It is a nervous system doing precisely what a nervous system does when the environment has felt hostile long enough. When money was uncertain, when the relationship was strained, when the fatigue became ambient, the body pulled inward. It reduced everything it read as optional. And to a system under that kind of sustained pressure, movement reads as optional. The stillness wasn't weakness. It was conservation. That distinction matters, not as comfort, but as a starting point. You cannot navigate from a map that shows the wrong location. So here's where we actually are. The 30-year study tracked thousands of men and women through middle age and beyond, measuring not just how long they lived, but the quality of the machinery they lived inside. The men who maintained resistance training through their 50s and 60s weren't just statistically healthier. They moved through their days differently, made decisions differently. After a hard conversation or a piece of bad news, they recovered faster, not emotionally in the therapeutic sense, but physiologically. Cortisol dropped sooner. Sleep ran deeper. The inflammatory markers, the biological equivalent of a house where every smoke alarm is going off simultaneously, were quieter in their bodies. And the researchers noted something that got almost no attention when the findings were covered. The benefit wasn't proportional to intensity. The men doing the heaviest training didn't outperform the men doing moderate, consistent resistance work. What the data tracked was not the load. It was the signal, the repeated act of choosing to move against resistance over time. That word, signal, is the one worth holding. Because here's what it feels like before we explain what it is. Picture the last time you did something genuinely demanding with your body. Not frantic, not punishing, hard in the way that requires everything to narrow down to what you're doing right now. The breath syncing with the effort, slow and deliberate. A heat that begins somewhere below the sternum and moves outward through your arms, your hands, into the air around you. And then the moment after, when something in the chest drops into a register that isn't tired, exactly. Quieter, heavier in a way that feels like ground rather than weight. That sensation is not the aftermath of exertion. It is your nervous system receiving a specific piece of information and updating what it believes about you. The update is what the study was measuring. Years of stillness were also a transmission, not a punishment, a frequency, one that shaped what you noticed was a story in the news a few weeks ago. One of those pieces buried beneath the louder emergencies. About a 51-year-old man in Ohio who had started exercising again after his doctor told him, with a particular clinical flatness doctors use when they want something to land, that his blood work looked like someone who had stopped caring. The man told the reporter he didn't feel like someone who had stopped caring. He felt like someone who was very, very tired and couldn't always tell the difference. That piece stayed with me longer than it should have, probably because the distinction he was making between not caring and being exhausted past the point of ordinary language is one that most coverage of men's health completely misses. The commentary that followed was the usual kind, inspiring, instructional, a little too bright around the edges. Tips for getting started. Reasons to believe in yourself. It meant well, and it landed nowhere the way things do when they skip over the actual whether a person is standing in and go straight to recommending a different code. What nobody said, and what the research actually shows, is that most men over 45 who attempt to restart some form of physical training fail not because they lack motivation, but because they encounter a sequence of experiences that feel like personal failure and are, in fact, entirely predictable, biological and psychological responses with specific mechanisms that nobody names in advance. The man in Ohio wasn't weak. He was walking into something with a blindfold on, and the blindfold is standard issue. The first thing that happens is the pain, not the ache a person remembers from their 30s. That productive tightness that used to appear the morning after a hard session, worn like evidence of something accomplished. This is different. It arrives in the second morning, settles into the hips and the upper back like something structural is failing, and it doesn't feel like training. It feels like damage, which in a specific sense it is. Muscle tissue after 45 repairs more slowly. The satellite cells responsible for rebuilding after effort run on a longer timeline than they did 15 years ago. Not broken, but genuinely changed. Someone who begins at the intensity they remember it taking, the effort that used to feel like the minimum, accumulates micro-trauma faster than the repair mechanism processes it. The body doesn't read that as effort. It reads it as threat. And when the body registers threat, it begins a quiet negotiation, the kind that happens below the level of conscious decision, with a willingness to go back. 2 days later, when going back is theoretically possible, the negotiation has already produced its conclusion. What corrects this requires nothing. No equipment, no trainer, no particular setting. It requires beginning at roughly 60% of what feels like the minimum. The nervous system needs to learn the shape of the movement before the muscle can be asked to adapt to load, and when that sequence is respected, when the first sessions feel almost insultingly easy, the soreness stays manageable, the movement quality improves, and something more important happens. The person wants to return. In the first 4 weeks, that one is the only metric with any meaning at all. The second thing that happens is harder to locate, but you can feel it coming. Somewhere during or after a session, something in a person compares, not to another body in the room, to their own body, a version of it that existed at 34 or 39 when the weight moved differently, when the face in the mirror answered differently. This isn't vanity. Researchers call it temporal self-appraisal, and it carries an emotional signature closer to grief than to disappointment. A quality of loss that feels permanent because the distance feels permanent. What the data actually shows is that the men who sustain progress through this aren't the ones who stop making the comparison. They're the ones who shorten its window. Not 15 years, 7 days. The brain's reward circuitry responds to relative gain within spans it can hold in working memory. The same body, the same mirror, but a gap of a week instead of a decade reads as momentum rather than irreversible decline. The practical application is concrete and unglamorous. Stop using who you were in 2009 as the reference point. Use who you were last Wednesday. The architecture of motivation actually requires this. It isn't optimism. It's how the mechanism functions. The third thing is the one that quietly ends the most genuine attempts. Opened a question and left it hanging. Over 45 before any result has a chance to take hold. Not motivation failures, not discipline failures. The first was training for who you used to be. The body was sending as communication, not weakness. Those 3 patterns, that's what we were tracking. Now you know what they are, and more importantly, you know why they work against you at this specific stage of life. Because the mechanism isn't psychological, it's biological. The body after 45 doesn't need more pressure. It needs a different kind of conversation. There's a moment in every serious training session. Not the first few minutes, not the warm-up, but somewhere in the middle. The bar is cold when you grip it and warm by the 3rd set. The chalk dust is still hanging. Your breathing has found its own pace, and there's a low heat that has moved from the muscle into something closer to the bone. And somewhere inside that, something shifts. It's subtle. It doesn't announce itself. But something inside you stops defending and starts building. If you felt it, you know exactly what I mean. If you haven't yet, that's what this is really about. Because building muscle after 45 is not recovery. It's not compensation. It is not an apology to the body for the years you didn't train, or the years you did but didn't sleep enough, or the decade where the job came first and the gym membership went unused, and you told yourself you'd get back to it when things slowed down. Things never slowed down, and now you're here. Here's the thing about that. Hold that as a physical fact, not an idea. Anyone that the window is real, that the choice to show up today is not trivial, and the body knows the difference. Research on intention and physical output, not the vague kind, but studies tracking neuromuscular activation, always available. You already know this feeling. That low-grade tightness when someone mentions their marathon training, their decade-long discipline, the body they've been carefully tending since their 20s. You know the quiet arithmetic that runs automatically. How many years you didn't, how many mornings you let pass, how far behind the math suggests you already are. That particular exhaustion isn't physical. It lives somewhere between the sternum and the throat. It's the feeling of believing you missed the window. What if the window isn't where you were told it was? There's a finding sitting in plain language inside the conclusion section of a 30-year longitudinal analysis. Researchers who spent 3 decades in rooms smelling of antiseptic and old paper, watching bodies age under fluorescent light, tracking what held and what hollowed out, what stiffened and what stayed supple. The finding is not buried. It isn't hedged into footnotes. It's right there, and people read past it because it doesn't fit the story we've been handed about time and the body. The story goes like this: earlier is better. Start young. Build before the questions begin. The person who began at 22 is already ahead. The person now, finally, lacing up at 45 is playing from behind. This sounds like common sense. It has the weight of settled fact, and it is wrong. Not in a sloppy, misread the chart way, but in the way that once you see it clearly, something in your chest loosens, and you understand that what you've been carrying as a deficit was never that at all. The study tracked participants across 3 decades. Different demographics, different starting conditions, different histories written into their tissue. When researchers isolated the group, showing the most significant improvements in the markers that actually govern how long and how well you live, cardiovascular function, muscle preservation, inflammatory load, metabolic flexibility, that group was not the people who began young and maintained. It was the people who began late. The ones for whom the first real load on real muscle arrived after the world had already spent decades working on them. The benefits weren't smaller, they were larger. Where your body can go is not a measure of how much you lost. It is potential energy with your name on it. It is a gap your biology is There's a finding the researchers buried on page 41 of the supplemental data, and almost no outlet touched it. Not because it was concealed, it was sitting there in plain language, available to anyone who read past the abstract. But it didn't fit the headline structure. Headlines need clean arcs: deficit, intervention, recovery. What this finding described wouldn't compress into that. The researchers themselves slowed down around it, became careful in their language. They called it late initiation benefit asymmetry, which is a precise way of saying the people who began strength training in their late 50s and early 60s didn't just close the gap with those who started earlier. In several of the tracked outcomes, grip endurance, postural recovery, bone mineral density, they outperformed the early starters by year 5. Not in peak numbers, in rate of change. The late starters were improving faster. Their bodies were responding with something the data registered as urgency, as though the system had been holding capacity in reserve, as though it recognized that something time-sensitive was finally underway and decided to commit. Don't receive that as inspiration. That flattens it, makes it into a poster. Receive it as a finding, because what it implies changes the terms of a conversation a lot of men over 45 have been running in the background for years. The conversation that opens with "I waited too long." The one that does the arithmetic and decides the margin has closed. The finding on page 41 says the arithmetic was wrong, not the feeling. The arithmetic. Here's where this needs to land, because this series hasn't been about exercise, not its core. We've moved through 13 signals, each one a place where biology and behavior intersect, where a body that has been absorbing the world's noise is either breaking that pattern or calcifying inside it. The difference between a system bracing for impact and a system actively building. But data on a supplemental page isn't where this started. It started with something that was actually happening in the world. In January of this year, 3 separate longitudinal cohort studies, one out of Copenhagen, one from the UK Biobank, one from a consortium of Canadian university hospitals, published findings within the same 6-week window. Each was studying a different question. Each landed in the same territory. The Copenhagen group had been tracking 4,200 men over 50 for 11 years, measuring not just cardiovascular markers, but cortisol rhythms, sleep architecture, and what they were calling autonomic flexibility, the nervous system's capacity to shift between threat response and recovery. What they found, and what the Reuters Health Desk covered in 2 paragraphs before moving on to something else, was that the men with the steepest declines in autonomic flexibility weren't sedentary by conventional measures. They were men with high daily news consumption, low physical load, and what the study classified as chronic low-intensity vigilance. Not panic, not crisis, just the baseline hum of a system that had learned to stay half-ready all the time for something that never fully arrives. The body running a tab it can't close. The cortisol slightly elevated at 11 p.m. The jaw held. The sleep that doesn't finish its job. That's not a metaphor. That's a clinical pattern with a measurable signature, and it showed up consistently across all 3 studies. The Copenhagen data is where the late initiation finding becomes something more than a data point. Because when they isolated the subgroup who had introduced structured physical load, resistance training specifically, after the age of 58, the autonomic flexibility numbers didn't just stabilize. They began recovering at a rate the lead researcher described in the press release, before the press release was quietly revised as unexpectedly robust. The revision softened it to clinically meaningful. Both are true. The first one is more honest. What that means in practical terms: the body's capacity to regulate itself, to move between alert and at rest, to process threat signals without letting them run on a loop, to sleep with the depth that restores rather than just pauses. That capacity was not fixed. Not in men of 58, not in men of 63. The system retained the ability to change direction. It just needed a load it recognized as real. That's what the researchers on page 41 were seeing. Not motivation, not willpower, a biological response to a genuine physical signal, the kind the body interprets as directional information, the kind it takes seriously. The men in the study who began late didn't describe it as desperation. A secondary questionnaire asked them to characterize their initial reasons for starting. The answers clustered in one direction: not fear of what had been lost, but a specific kind of clarity that had arrived. Something had resolved for them, not dramatically. They didn't describe a moment of crisis or revelation. They described something quieter, a morning where the calculation finally felt different, where the question shifted from "is it too late?" to "what does the next 5 years actually look like if I do this? And what does it look like if I don't?" Two concrete futures held next to each other until one of them became the obvious choice. That's not mysticism. That's risk assessment with emotional honesty applied to it. The men who arrived at that assessment and acted on it showed up in the data 5 years later as outliers, improving at rates the model hadn't anticipated, recovering capacities that cross-sectional studies had suggested were gone. They weren't exceptional people. The study controlled for that. They were people who had made a decision at a specific moment and then made it again repeatedly until the body registered it as direction rather than experiment. The question the final chapter is going to hold is this: what does that decision look like before it becomes habit, in the hours and days immediately after the clarity arrives, when the system is still deciding whether to treat it as signal or noise? That's where we go next. You're standing in front of a mirror, not the one in your bathroom with the overhead light that finds every line, not a metaphor, a real one, the kind you passed this morning without fully stopping, the kind that caught the edge of your face and let you move on before you had to decide what you saw. In broadcasting, not as distress calls, but as capacity. And I told you at the start that by the time we finished, I wouldn't answer that question with optimism. I'd answer it with something harder to argue with. Here it is. Before, or to do again what they'd stopped asking them to do. The finding, stripped of its academic language, is this: the people who built and maintained muscle mass after 45 did not just live longer in years. They lived longer in function, in the capacity to carry their own groceries, climb their own stairs, get up off the floor when they needed to. They retained the biological machinery of someone younger, not because they found a shortcut, but because they gave that machinery a reason to stay. The researchers measured muscle, but what they were really measuring was signal. The signal a body receives when it is asked to do hard things. And the body, it turns out, listens. It responds. It rebuilds. Not infinitely, not magically, but measurably, reliably across 3 decades of data. in people who were told by every cultural cue around them that the window had closed. The window had not closed. Now stand in front of that mirror again. Same one from the beginning of this video. This time, stay a moment. Notice how the glass holds a slight chill if you're close enough. The kind that makes you aware of the air between you and your own reflection. The room is probably quiet or close to it. Whatever sound is there, traffic outside or the hum of something electrical, it doesn't fill the space the way sound usually does. It just sits there with you. What's different is not the reflection. The lines are where they were. The gray, if it's there, hasn't moved. The years written into your face haven't been edited. None of that changed. What's different is the person looking. Because 12 signals ago, you came to this video carrying that question the way most people carry it, as a verdict already half delivered, as something you were checking to confirm. You wanted the science to be real, but some part of you had already started hedging, already started deciding what you'd accept instead. And then something happened that wasn't a lecture. It wasn't a list of things to buy or a regimen to follow before your phone lights up. It was something quieter than that, a series of recognitions. The jaw tightening when the news comes on, the grip you didn't know you were holding, the breath that moves differently at 7 in the morning than it does at 7 at night. The way your body has been trying to tell you something all along, and you've been too busy receiving the world to hear it. You heard some of it tonight. Maybe not all of it, but enough that something shifted. Not in the information, but in the direction you're facing. Here's the last thing I'll leave you with, and it's not an instruction. The muscle you're going to build next month, if you choose to, doesn't exist yet as tissue. It hasn't been synthesized. It hasn't been broken down and rebuilt. It's not in your body right now, in any form a scanner could find, but it exists as a decision. And the 30-year data has something to say about that, too. The participants who showed the most durable gains weren't the ones who started with the most capacity. They were the ones who showed up once, imperfectly, on some unremarkable Tuesday when nothing felt ready, and then came back. That first session, before any measurable adaptation, before the body had changed anything a test could detect, that session still counted. It was the signal. The body filed it, and it began, in ways that only became visible weeks later, to respond. That's not a motivational reframe. That's what the data shows. Which brings us back to the mirror, still cool against the air in front of it. Still showing you the same face it showed you this morning when you moved past it too quickly to decide what you saw. The answer to the question we open with is not yes, and it is not no. It is something more precise than either. It is, the decision is the beginning, and you've already made it, or you wouldn't still be standing here. You know what the research says now? You know what 12 signals of biological capacity actually mean. You know that the 30-year study wasn't tracking extraordinary people. It was tracking people who simply didn't stop. The mirror shows you someone who knows that now. That's different than before.